Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Michael Green, Senior Vice President for Asia here at CSIS and a professor of Georgetown. But what I'm most famous for is the back cover blurb that I gave for this excellent new book by my friends and colleagues who are here today. Josh Eisenman from UT Austin and Eric Higginbotham from MIT are going to discuss their new book, China Steps Out: Beijing's Major Power Engagement with the Developing World, in a discussion that will be moderated by Bonnie Glaser of CSIS, Senior Advisor on Asia and Director of our China Power Project, which has found innovative ways to assess China's power in different domains, put it in comparative perspective. Perfect person to moderate. So I'll turn the mic over in a moment to Bonnie. Bonnie will be the security officer for you, which we now anoint before every major program we do in case we have to flee the building, and she'll be in charge. But you will go back out the first floor exit that we're now on and, in theory, reconvene at National Geographic, although I suspect if we all have to leave the building, people will just go home. So do what Bonnie says as soon as I step off the podium. This is a terrific book. It's the second edition, or a new version, I should say, of a book that that Joshua and Eric wrote in 2007, which was an in-depth look at how China was advancing its interests, interacting with, fundamentally changing in some cases, different regions of the world: the Middle East, Latin America, South Asia. These guys were well ahead of the rest of the academic world in defining this new phenomenon and finding the best scholars to come together in an edited volume to unpack it and figure out what was happening, come up with some cross-regional themes and what we're seeing in Chinese behavior. That was in 2007. They've done a new version, and what was in 2007 was the process of putting together bits and pieces of evidence and comparing it across regions. In 2018 is a holy cow, China's everywhere study, and so the dynamic is very, very different. We know more. China's not 10 feet tall anymore. We've seen many flaws in China's approach in terms of its diplomacy, its soft power, but fundamentally shaping the dynamics within regions, sub-regions, in ways that perhaps Eric and Josh didn't anticipate in 2007. That might be a good question for them. It certainly is dynamic. When I was the senior Asia official on the National Security Council staff in 2004-05, the senior director for Western Hemisphere, Tom Shannon, came to see me because he said, in our region, this is 2004-05, our ambassadors, our chiefs of mission, our mission directors for AID, they're asking for instructions from the State Department and from AID on what to do about China, because China's presence was suddenly becoming an important part of what they were seeing within their region, within their countries. I had East and South Asia. I could clearly see it happening. There's a long history of China's interaction with Pakistan and India. But then the senior director for Africa came, and we ended up in late 2004, early 2005, I'm now unilaterally declassifying this, I'll probably be arrested. But in late 2004, 2005, we did a series of deputies committee meetings in the NSC in the sit room, where each regional senior director presented with their state, defense, AID, treasury colleagues, what China was doing in these regions. And we went into it open-minded. It was 2004 and 5. We didn't have the concerns about China we have today. We tried to assess it. The senior director for Africa said, this is not necessarily bad. Africa needs more infrastructure, needs more development money, but we're worried about corruption. We're worried about undermining conditionality for World Bank or European or American aid. There were different assessments of what was going on. We came up with a series of instructions we sent out to Post to report more on this. But honestly, we didn't have a strategy yet, and I wonder if we do today. So it's really an interesting topic. You were going to talk to two of the first out of the gate to identify it as a major trend in international relations and capture it in their first book and then in this book. So thank you both for coming. I'm going to turn it over to Bonnie. Do you want to go right to the first speaker, or do you want to?
I will just very briefly introduce their title so everybody knows
Okay.
who
Well,
they
let me
are.
just thank you then and turn it over to
Yes,
Bonnie.
sure.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mike. We will just have some brief remarks by each of the leading authors and editors, and then have a brief discussion just among ourselves, and then we'll turn it all over to you for your Q&A. But we'll start with Josh Eisenman, who's a senior fellow for China Studies at the American Foreign Policy Council, as well as assistant professor at the University of Texas Austin's Lyndon Baines Johnson School of Public Affairs, and then the co-editor, Eric Higginbotham, who's principal research scientist at MIT's Center for International Studies and a specialist in Asian security issues. So with that, we'll start with you, Josh.
Great. Thank you so much, Bonnie. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you so much, Bonnie. Thank you to Mike. And, let me just say thank you to CSIS, right? Because this project actually would never have even happened without CSIS. As I'm looking at Derek Mitchell here in the front row, who was actually worked on and was a co-editor on the first volume, most of the discussions for that volume took place at CSIS. And actually the contributors for that volume, Matt Orsman, Raf Pantucci, and others, were CSIS people. So it's really fitting that this book be launched here at CSIS because CSIS was the birthplace of the original book. Of course, I want to recognize the authors, Evan Ellis, Derek Mitchell, and Ambassador David Shin, who did great work on this volume, and we're very grateful for your help. And of course, Eric, who is just a great person to work with on this project and brought a lot of the knowledge, especially in the security sphere, that I lack and I'm very grateful for. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't thank my wife, Iris, who I'm grateful is here today, and my mother for watching our kids so she could be. Just a couple of observations I want to start off with so we can get into a robust discussion. And I want to kind of trace us back to the initiation of the project, the first book here that I have in my hand. And that was when I was a lowly analyst at the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, and making phone calls to try to get people to testify, and it was the early 2000s, and nobody wanted to do it. Right, the commission had a bad reputation. They're the evil commission. They're terrible. What are you doing? You're causing problems in the U.S.-China relationship. And so it was tough. Right, it was like cold calling. And at that point, I would say that there were three primary ideas about the U.S.-China relationship. I just want to quickly put them out on the table. The first one, which I think Jim Mann calls the soothing scenario, is that China would become a liberal democracy. Right, that China would over time evolve into a liberal democracy. The second was that China would kind of muddle through with a collective leadership system, right? That there would be different leaders with different power bases, and they would balance off of each other, kind of as we saw during the Hu Jintao administration. And then the third, and I would say this is the minority view, would be that the Communist Party of China couldn't survive and that it would fall. And I would say that would be the minority view, but it was still a view that was held by people who knew China pretty well. But what we did not hear during that period, at least I can't find it in any of my notes or anything I read or anything I wrote or anything anybody else wrote, is that we would revert back to the chairman of all things mentality. That we revert to go from collective leadership to unitary leadership. That we would have a leader who is clearly in charge of China in ways that we haven't seen in decades. And so I think that we should start maybe with a bit of modesty. Right, as sinologists, we got this one wrong, pretty badly wrong too at that. But I'm proud to say there's one thing we didn't get wrong. I remember Derek and I had a conversation and we talked about the title for this book, and we talked about this idea, Beijing's strategy for the 21st century. And is Beijing's strategy for the 21st century really the developing world? At the point that we were thinking about this book in 2005 and 2006, that was an open question, as I think Mike said honestly and correctly. But I don't think it is anymore, right? With One Belt, One Road now enshrined in the Chinese Constitution, I think we can clearly say it is. It is China's strategy for the 21st century. Not only has the last 10 years said that, the leadership of China now says that. And so we as sinologists got some things wrong, but I'm proud to say we didn't get that wrong, at least not the people in this room. And so that's one thing I'm really proud of, that we were early to this, and we discussed it in a very serious way at a very early date. And now I'd just like to put together, just 3 quick points to highlight from the book, and in general. The first is a concern that's being raised more and more and more, and I want to put it out there, and that's the issue of debt and debt-driven growth in general. In a lot of ways, China's development model is debt-driven growth, right? Chinese state-owned banks lend to Chinese state-owned enterprises. They go round and round. The state-owned enterprises lose the money. Then they clear the books, and then they loan them a whole new another round. And so now what we see in One Belt, One Road is an expansion of this outside of China. And so there's a big question. Is this going to work? Can you run this debt-driven approach outside of your borders? And there's been several recent reports that suggest that's problematic. One report that was released suggests that 23 countries are in jeopardy now, and 8 countries are in deep distress. And that's problematic, and it's a question for us to think about, because there were so many people talking about the problems of Chinese domestic debt, but for so long that has simply muddled through and not become a crisis. I think it's right for us to ask whether the externalization of that process is problematic or not. Similarly, we have long heard, those of us who study China, that something about Chinese people makes them save more, that Chineseness equals savings. But since 2009, that has not been the case, and there has been a rapid increase in household debt, such that your average household in China now has a worse debt-to-income ratio than the average American household. I can't believe I've said that, but I have, and it is true. And so we are in a new normal, as Xi Jinping calls it, but an economic new normal and a political new normal. And I think we have to be cognizant of these debt issues more than ever before, but for different reasons than people were waving the red flag previously. So I want to put that on the table as an issue, and it's an issue throughout the developing world in terms of China's approach to these countries. Second, I want to put on the table the issue of China's party-to-party relations. The Communist Party of China's relations with political parties, certainly in Africa, is something I've spent a lot of time studying, but around the world. And that's something that is stressed in this book by all of the authors. It's a growing facet of the relationship, and China is spending millions, tens of millions, if not billions of dollars every year to enhance these relations. And I would argue there is purpose behind that, and that they would be foolish to do it if there wasn't purpose behind that. And that after 5,000 years of hosting foreigners and engaging with foreigners, there is definitely something behind it. And I think increasingly, with the comments from Xi Jinping and others, we're starting to see that there is a Chinese approach that is being proffered here. And that is something that, even a few years ago, we didn't hear much about. In fact, when you would say something called the China model, people would say, no, there's no model. These are not the droids you're looking for. But, sorry, you get the reference. But I believe these are the droids we are looking for. And so I think that this is a real moment where things are changing in terms of a recognition, both on the Chinese and on the foreign side, that China does have something to offer and is actually offering it. And then third, I'd like to kind of take my hat off to Beijing. They've been really successful in this approach. And we can talk more about what this approach is, right? Unpack that statement. But I think that they've been amazingly successful. And one of the elements of this book is to suggest that they have been. Now, that has not been without problems, as Mike accurately said. And we can talk ad nauseum about all of the mistakes and all the problems that have been made. But I do think that we wouldn't even be here writing another book if this had not advanced, if this strategy was not adopted wholesale, pushed forward, and in many ways been quite successful in garnering support from the developing countries of the world. And so I think from a public perspective, as Americans, we should be wise enough to look at what China's done and at least recognize its successes, and if we can, where we can, perhaps even learn from them. And that's all I've got to say, so I'm going to turn it over to Eric.
Great, thanks a lot for coming out. And I want to second Josh's thanks to CSIS rather, for hosting us, and to Bonnie Glazer and Mike Green and Derek Mitchell. Get this formulation right, all of whom are young friends from long ago. Hope that's right. When we published the first volume in 2007, China was in the midst of what was then called a charm offensive. So the concern then was that China might make inroads by being more appealing than the United States. And there have certainly been some constants in the equation since then, but much has also changed. Chinese leaders have become more confident in the pursuit of their national interests. In part, this is simply a function of increasing national power, the growth of the economy. China's economy, GDP has doubled in real terms since 2007. It's become the largest, or became the largest trading state in 2013, and it's gone from being a niche player in investment overseas to being one of the largest today. Whatever the causes, though, Xi Jinping and other foreign leaders and elites have largely abandoned Deng Xiaoping's dictum to maintain a low profile, and they instead promote what they term major power diplomacy with Chinese characteristics. Although Chinese diplomacy continues to slant heavily in the economic direction in terms of both objectives and means, this is much less true today than it was then. Political elements are more prominent, and in some cases, the pursuit of national interests has taken on a distinctly hard edge. The global financial crisis of 2008-2009 was a turning point of sorts. It convinced many Chinese that its own model of economic growth, as Josh said, was largely correct and that the West was in relative decline. It seemed to affirm China's longstanding view or assertion that the world was becoming more multipolar and democratic. And it opened the possibility that China could, to an extent, accelerate that process and work with like-minded states to revise the rules of the game. In 2016, Deputy Foreign Minister He Yafei said China is a central motive force in the reform of global governance, and he said that China should work with other nations that seek a multipolar world and a democratic international order. Clearly, many of those states are in the developing world, and if the 2008 crisis showed that the West was in decline, Beijing also interpreted that or saw that as an indicator of the rise of the developing world. States in the developing world have become more important since then in Beijing's thinking, and China's adopted a more nuanced approach and a more nuanced way of thinking about those states. The Chinese lexicon now recognizes distinctions in that realm, and it places special emphasis on new categories, what it calls major developing states or newly emerging powers. And these are developing states with particular economic and political heft. And we can identify 2 or 3 states in each region that sort of fall into that category. So China's role in the BRICS grouping, its promotion of the G20 as an alternative, a more important alternative to the G7 or the G8, are all consistent with that view and with their assumption of the value of partnership with major developing states. Beyond this, all the chapters of the volume make it clear that China's engagement with the developing world is what might be termed comprehensive. I'll again borrow some language from He Yafei, who said that Chinese foreign policy was multi-centric, multi-layered, multi-pivotal sub-networks of regional and international cooperation that are interconnected and interwoven. And I think that's actually apt language. Like all countries, there are bilateral, regional, and global elements to China's approach, but China's regional diplomacy is, I think, better developed than most. China has either plugged into or created comprehensive regional groupings with which it engages on equal terms in all of the regions that we looked at. First with Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it's now plugged into a number of forums with ASEAN. In Africa, it's the Forum on China-African Cooperation, et cetera, et cetera. To be sure, much of the actual work gets done at the bilateral level, and I think Evan made great points in his chapter on Latin America about the extent to which that's true, but major initiatives are often launched at the regional level, and the framework is established there. The other aspect of comprehensive engagement is the fact that it's all-encompassing and it has economic, political, security, and cultural aspects. Again, that's true of all countries' foreign policy, but in the Chinese case, it's much more self-conscious and systematic in the way that it goes about knitting those together. We've included white papers in the volume, and if you look at any of them really, but if you look at the China-Africa white paper in the back of the volume, it talks about cooperation in 7 domains: political, international affairs, economics and trade, et cetera, and then it breaks that down into 25 specific areas or programs. Americans might tend to view that as window dressing, which in some sense, of course, it is, but there are programs and there's money behind each of those initiatives and each of those programs. And in at least some cases, China has done a fairly clever job of putting these together in strategic ways. So in 2014 and 15, I pulled a fait accompli in the South China Sea, reclaiming more than 3,000 acres of land on 7 features and built very substantial military bases there. But as it did that, it also pushed what it's called the 2+7 cooperation framework with ASEAN. So the two were 2 political consensuses. Building trust is central to closer cooperation, and economic development and cooperation should be central to the relationship. And then the 7 were specific proposals. 3 were economic, 3 were confidence building, and 1 had to do with cultural exchange. And then if you look at the reaction from Southeast Asia, with the states there having little prospect for reversing Chinese gain and with the prospect of receiving massive Chinese investment, I think it's safe to say there has in fact been, the response has been more muted than many of us might have expected. And this is where I think the work of Mike Green and others at CSIS is particularly important in highlighting and bringing transparency to China's action in the South China Sea and in other maritime areas. There's no question that economic means still take pride of place, but I'll end here with saying a little something about the growing military role, and still secondary, but growing role of military engagement in Chinese foreign policy in the developing world. Broadly speaking, that falls into 5 categories. The first is China's substantial commitment to international peacekeeping. China's consistently among the top 10 contributors of peacekeeping personnel in the world, and it has the largest contingent from among the UN Security Council Permanent 5. A second element is military diplomacy, including fleet visits, combined exercises, high-level exchanges, and educational exchanges. The history of this is fairly recent. It conducted its first combined exercise in 2002. Many of these activities began with basically geographically, so Central Asia first, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, and have since expanded outwards to some extent. A third element is the coercive use of force, and I already mentioned the South China Sea. China, of course, would define these activities as activities in defense of its own sovereignty. And oftentimes it is reacting to the actions of others, but it often does so in a scale and extent that's asymmetrically large compared to the activities it's ostensibly in response to. Fourth is the protection of assets and citizens overseas, a goal that was established under the 2004 new historic missions. It's conducted evacuation operations of its own citizens in Libya in 2011 and Yemen in 2015. It's now dispatched 27 task forces to the Gulf of Aden to conduct escort operations. And now with its base, very substantial military base in Djibouti, it's in a better position to do this across a larger part of at least Eastern Africa and potentially the Middle East and Indian Ocean area. And then a fifth area is weapons sales. In 2007, China was the 10th largest supplier of arms in the world. Today, or at least in 2016, it had risen to 5th place. Its sales had quadrupled. It sells to a limited range of customers, mostly Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Thailand, but that's a growing group, and it exports a wider array of products than it once did. So its major categories are ships, aircraft, anti-aircraft systems, and missiles. And I think if we look at these 5 areas, I mean, they're all important, but arms sales in particular are likely to cement long-term strategic relations in the developing world. They come with an array of long-term servicing and parts requirement, as well as trainers and the exchange of military personnel and military thinking. So again, it's just sort of scratching the surface in a descriptive way, but I'll close there. Thanks.
Great. So one of the things that I really like about this book is its structure. It's very well organized, and it starts in the introduction making very clear what it's trying to achieve and what the questions were that were given to each author. And it really looks in an evolutionary way at Chinese foreign policy towards the developing world, and talks about some of the changes that have taken place, starting with Derek Mitchell's great chapter, really going back to sort of the dynasties, which is very important to get an evolutionary sense of where did this all start. And a key message that really comes across in this book is how China's interests have expanded. And so China's interests involve resources, involve getting support from the developing world for Taiwan and the One China principle, to push back against countries that criticize China on human rights, for example, at the United Nations, to promote China's image so that China can have some soft power. May not have soft power here, but it does in places in the developing world. So China's interests have really, really expanded. And so what I'm going to start by asking, and I'll start with you, Josh, is this issue of approaches. So what are the means, what are the approaches that China is using, and what are the strengths and weaknesses of those approaches? You alluded to the fact that China's been pretty successful. So why is it working, and what's working, and what isn't working?
Wow, that's a great question. Hard one to answer. Well, hard one to answer in brief. Well, I would say if we talk about strengths first, one of the major strengths is the coordinated nature of the approach itself. That you've got an economic, political, and military approach that is intentionally meant to bolster each other. And so you've got military sales, which are both an economic deal for Norinco, but they have a strategic aim as well. And then they have a political aim in terms of enhancing the relations with that country's political leadership. And similarly, we can talk about the party-to-party relationship, bolstering and supporting Chinese state-owned enterprises and creating what China would like to see in terms of a stable environment, a stable political environment, so it can achieve its economic objectives. So what I've in the past called a packaged approach or a coordinated approach is probably the strength that China brings to the table. It doesn't shy away from the fact that it is coordinating these approaches. In fact, that's part of the kind of overlapping, interlocking nature of it. Similarly, as Eric spoke about in his comments, you do have this bilateral, multilateral, and global approaches, which are also interlocking. And China has created institutions where it had wanted them. So it's created the China-Africa Cooperation Forum. It's created similar forums in Latin America and other places. And these are similar type of institutions where China is balanced off against an entire region. You'll have a meeting in China, and then you'll have a meeting in a country of the region, right? And so this enhances the asymmetry of the relationship. It places China on par with an entire region, and it gives China a lot of agenda-setting power when it comes to determining what's going to be talked about and in what way. Now, in terms of the negative side, I would say where China's weakest is in terms of its civil society. I mean, you could argue if China even has a real civil society. I mean, that's an argument that we could go in circles chasing our tail on. But when it comes to, say, educational exchanges or what China calls people-to-people exchanges, these aren't really organic. They are always political and almost always funded and intentionally driven by the party. And what that means is that they're limited in terms of how genuine they are, right? When you force your rap stars to rap about how great Xi Jinping is, you shouldn't be surprised the global sales aren't high, right? There's a lack of genuineness to it. And I would say that when we talk about where China's kind of weaker, it's still weaker in terms of that personal interaction level, I would say, and especially on the educational front, dealing with human rights organizations for sure, dealing with labor organizations. So in a lot of ways, what China does externally mirrors what it does internally. So if you look internally and say, hey, China's weak when it comes to these things, I'd bet you most often they have problems with that externally as well. So I would say that this, if we look and we only use the guise of IR theory to understand Chinese foreign policy, I think we're going to be really confused. Because a lot of what we see externally is a reflection of what goes on internally. And so I would say one of the things we talk about in this book and elsewhere is how Chinese domestic politics is an important driver of foreign policy.
Great.
Thank you.
Eric, when Xi Jinping spoke at the 19th Party Congress and for the first time presented China's development model, his economic model, as an option for developing countries, I think that was surprising for a lot of people. How does that resonate in the developing world? Do countries in the developing world want to be, do they want to model themselves after China? Do they want to adopt this model and implement it for themselves?
Another great question, another question that's difficult to answer. And I think it depends on the, obviously the partner, the potential partner that you're talking about. But I think, what has traditionally been called sort of a no strings attached approach, or in a certain sense, an apolitical approach to engagement, does resonate widely in much of the developing world, especially some of the poorest parts where governance is poor. China clearly puts economic development and developmental model above governance reform, and that's quite different than U.S. priorities in its foreign policy and its engagement with much of the developing world. So I think that does resonate. There is pushback. I think, as Josh said, the weakness in China's approach is the weakness of China's civil society. China doesn't have, to an extent, it's developing it, but it doesn't have strong norms of corporate norms of global citizenship. So, I think that hurts China's position and reputation in much of the developing world when Chinese companies come in and employ Chinese citizens and don't necessarily do as much for local communities as Western companies do, although I have to say much of that is new in the Western context as well.
I want to ask a question to you, Josh, about China's involvement, maybe even sort of interference in political activities in Africa. We've seen this in Australia, New Zealand, some other places. I was reading an article last week in The Diplomat that alleged there was Chinese backing for a political candidate from the All People's Congress who's running for president in Sierra Leone. Yeah. And that really raises the question to me. We know Beijing has long said it has a non-interference policy. That's changed over time. But is this a new trend that we're seeing, or has this been an element of China's policy towards the developing world that has really been present for a while, that maybe we just journalists and others, maybe even experts like me, have not paid enough attention to?
Well, yes. I mean, it has been around for a long time, but it has changed in really innovative and interesting ways. So the Communist Party of China's relations with Africa in particular, which is something that I actually just published an article about it during the Mao era, so I've done a lot of thinking. First, let me say this. Again, driven almost entirely by Chinese domestic needs for external legitimization of its own regime. When you track the machinations of China's Communist Party's relations with African political organizations, you see the Cultural Revolution, for example, is an important aspect. Well, why would it be? Well, it is because it's a domestic change, right? And then you have reform and opening up, and then that influences the way in which China's Communist Party interacts with African political parties. So first point is, domestic politics is always in the lead. In terms of the nature of the relations, they've kind of ebbed and flowed. I mean, in the 80s and in the 70s, you'd have the CPC building the headquarters, for example, of UNIP, which was then the leading party in Zambia. They would build the headquarters for them. And you'd see regularly within the Xinhua press, in the English language press, reports about grants and gifts being given directly, cash donations, to African political parties. And that kind of subsides in the late 80s and 90s. And then what we have is a rhetorical support, right? Meetings are happening, glad handing, that kind of thing. And maybe it's money changing hands, but it's not public. It's not openly discussed. But I would say more recently, especially since Xi Jinping took over, we've seen a change. And that change has been that in the past, China actually sent more delegations to Africa than it received. More CPC delegations would go to Africa, visit different African political parties, and hold meetings. Since 2012, however, that has flipped. And more African political parties are coming to China, spending time with the Communist Party, doing cadre training. Cadre training is something the Communist Party is now putting good money into. And we can ask why, right? If it's apolitical, why are you doing cadre training, right? This is an important question. But these issues of cadre training, and you were talking about Sierra Leone, I don't have a way to validate this, but I read the article you did and some other local articles which suggested that there is a very close long-term relationship that has been developed. And that China's supplying pins and buttons, and Chinese nationals are showing up wearing the colors of this political party at their rallies. And that, I would say, is relatively new. But I would also add to that China's relations in African countries has a lot to do with the nature of the politics in that country. If you are in a democratic African country, their ability to influence or be influential is to some degree limited. But in a place like Ethiopia, for instance, where Ambassador Shin was ambassador and knows very well, the Communist Party of China has had an extensive relationship with the EPRDF. And in some of the Chinese writings, I think some quoted in our chapter, the party members call Ethiopia the greatest student of the CPC, right? And so we can see in a lot of ways, a lot of the methods reflected in those students, in those better students. Rwanda has also been brought up. But what was interesting is when Ambassador Shin and I were recently in China asking this question, they would say, yes, there are several African countries that are very interested. But once you get below Ethiopia and Rwanda, you don't get many more, right? So the question, and I think it's an open question at this point, is will this more assertive, more involved, we could call it interference in some cases perhaps, approach, will it be effective? Will it be welcome? Will it have backlash and pushback? I suspect what we saw in Zambia with Michael Sata, that there will be a pushback, right? And in Chinese, you have a saying, on the top there is a policy, and on the bottom there is a pushback. So I'd be surprised if we don't see some kind of pushback as China gets heavily involved, or more involved, I would say, in African political party relations.
So one last question for you, Eric, and then we'll open it up. And I really wanted to talk a little bit about the U.S.-China relationship and how it connects with the developing world, and whether this is a source of friction in the future. And in your concluding chapter, which both of you co-authored, you state that U.S. and Chinese interests in the developing world are not zero-sum and intersect in some ways, but you also say that Chinese activities in the developing world threaten peace and stability. So there's maybe a little bit of tension there. In the Trump administration and the national security strategy, there's been a new framing of the U.S.-China relationship as China being a rival, revisionist power. And so there's clearly more strategic competition in this bilateral relationship. So what does this portend for the developing world and the factor of the developing world in the U.S.-China relationship? Is this something that we need to be more concerned about, that we're not just going to have strategic competition in trade or maybe on maritime issues, but that actually maybe the developing world is going to be an area where we will see a lot more direct competition, or is this going to remain very peripheral?
Right. Again, I think it depends on the region. The extent to which our interests overlap or compete depends largely on the region. So in Asia, the United States has allies. Some of those allies have territorial and other disputes with China. So in Asia is where our interests might collide most directly. Now, it's also worth saying that in Asia, China's interests are in tension with one another as well. There's a second area or sense in which our interests are in tension, and that is global governance and norms. And we see that really across the board. Looking at I wrote the Southeast Asia chapter of this as well. Yeah. Looking at Southeast Asia, I'll speak a bit to the issue that Josh just did, maybe a little bit more in a competitive context. China is clearly willing to engage everyone, democracies, really the gamut from democracies to fully authoritarian or totalitarian states. I'm not sure that's necessarily an enormous disadvantage with the democracies, depending on the specific case. But clearly, in an immediate, at least a short-term sense, it gives them a competitive advantage in vying for influence, at the other end of that spectrum with the authoritarian states. So, again, if we come back to the dispute over the South China Sea and China's activities there, one of China's tactics has been to buy off, essentially create client states among the poorest states in ASEAN. So the GDP of Laos is less than 2% of the GDP of Indonesia. And yet within the ASEAN context, it's consensus decision making. So if the vote is not unanimous, a joint declaration is not made. So China is able to pick off individual countries and sort of suppress a unified reaction. And it did that with Cambodia first, for 2012 maybe, and later with Laos when they held the rotating chair in ASEAN, and to prevent joint declarations coming out. So in that sense, I think there is a more calculated political competitive element in its cultivation of those regimes to an extent. I would like to believe that that's maybe a losing proposition for China in the long term, and that it comes to understand that. And maybe this is where we should talk to Derek, who has been a very prominent promoter of American values in Asia. So if we have time, I'd like to circle back to Derek. But.
Okay, we'll take a couple of questions, and then we'll give you an opportunity to weigh in. So please wait for the microphone. One of my fantastic members of my China Power staff will bring you a microphone, and then identify yourself. Okay, right here in front.
Dan Lieberman, I'm a writer. Yeah, people are predicting the demise of China economically for quite a long time, but most of their debt is really domestic debt. They owe it to each other, and they don't have too much foreign debt. Their household debt may be 48% to GDP, but the U.S. is 78%. So if you start looking at China debt situation compared to the U.S. debt situation, it doesn't seem as severe. But my real question is, I'd like to know if you have any statistics on China's engagement with Iran. Do they supply any armaments? And what is their commercial trade with Iran?
Okay, hold that. I think I'll collect a couple of questions, and then we'll come back to you. Okay, yes? Jonathan in front.
Let me see, maybe we do have some stats in the book.
Yeah, that's good.
Hi, Jonathan Strumseth from the Brookings Institution. I have two quick questions. One is, you described a very coordinated approach, kind of interlocking political, military, diplomatic. My question is sort of where is this all coming from within China? I mean, is it as simple as to say they have a one-party system, so it's all coming from the party? Or how can we sort of think of the formulation of this grand strategy, its sources and multiplicity of actors per se? The second, quickly for Eric, since you've mentioned Southeast Asia several times, and you wrote the chapter, I really look forward to reading it. I'm just curious, in your view, is Southeast Asia, kind of an incubator for broader kind of approaches for China in more far-reaching parts of the world? Or is it possibly just very unique because it's the backyard and there's things happening there we wouldn't necessarily see in other parts in the future? Thank you.
Great question. Okay, we'll take one more before we go back to the panel. Okay, back there.
Thank you. My name's Tom Gross. I'm retired from the UNESCO. I'm curious, in the climate controversies and the Paris Agreement, China finally came up in the Paris Agreement as a major actor, and their agreement to start changing their previous policy of being a developing country was key to moving the Paris agreements forward. Since then, China has become a huge developer in photovoltaics and other renewables. In other words, they're posed to play a huge role in helping developing states meet their requirements for future renewable energies. So I'm wondering, do you think this is altruistic? Is this a new system, an economic opportunity? Or how big will this part be to China's developments?
Okay, terrific. And I want to let you all know that we will be selling books after the event. So please do stay when we're finished. And let's go back to the panel. Who would like to start? Josh?
Yeah, and we will be signing them, right? That's a big deal.
That's right.
No shipping, no tax, right? This is a big deal here, right? And we've got other authors here who are happy to sign at a small cost, right? Great questions, and let me see if I can kind of touch on a bit so we can have another round, hopefully, if time permitting. So yes, people have been predicting the economic collapse of China for a long time. I think there was even a book by Gordon Chang about that, right? A long, long time ago. And they were wrong, and I would argue they were wrong because you had a part of the Chinese state lending money to another part of the Chinese state. Now, whether that be a state-owned enterprise or a local government, it's still a part of the Chinese state. What's different now, and this is where I would contest your numbers from what I've recently seen, is that Chinese household debt, from what I saw, is at 106%, and US is at 105%, which was the impetus for the article I saw written. And that has happened very recently, right? That has happened since 2009. And you cannot, although you can always transfer more money to another state-owned enterprise, you can't transfer money to 1.3 billion Chinese people because you would end up with massive inflation. You can't take 3.1 or whatever trillion dollars and just convert them, run the press all day and all night, and hand out money to all the Chinese people to pay off their debt. And that's problematic because it means that the old tricks to resolving the old problems cannot be deployed. And so I'm not sitting here on camera predicting the end of the Chinese economic model, but I am suggesting we are seeing new phenomenon in the model that need to be taken into consideration and that are more risky than what we've seen in the past. I, in the past, have never said that China's coming, collapse is coming. I'm certainly not doing that now, but I do think that this is something worth noting, especially because a lot of that debt is really high interest debt. Right? I mean, it's 20, 30, if not higher, and it's people who aren't going to pay it back, and there are people who are getting on blacklists, who can't get on airplanes, who can't get on. So there's a social impact of this, where you're creating an underclass. I mean, you're not creating debt or jail yet, but you are creating different kind of social problems that hadn't existed before and that we at least have to recognize and deal with and talk about. I'm putting it out there more of an issue as a discussion than I'm soothsaying what it all means. In terms of where is this all coming from, and I think Eric hit on a very important point, several of course, but one in particular, dealing with this issue of biding time and hiding capabilities, which was Deng Xiaoping's admonishment, right? Keep a low profile. But the whole idea of biding time and hiding capabilities, which goes back to ancient Chinese thinking, means that at one point you'll stop doing that. Right? Biding time and hiding capabilities isn't a permanent strategy. It's a temporary one that one pursues while one is weak. So in many ways, we could consider this the natural evolution of China's engagement with the world. Peaceful rise has rise in it, right? And rise means that there is an intentionality to, at some point, be risen, to be at the top, and to not be biding your time and hiding capabilities anymore. And I think that is a general consensus. What I think was interesting is the timing, the decision by the Xi leadership to say now is the time. And again, I think Eric is right. 2008, 2009 was the time when the, as I saw in Ran Zhongze's recent piece, the West malfunctioned. Right? The malfunctioning of the West was on display. And that became a moment of strategic opportunity, which then led us to today where we have this more assertive, more aggressive China. And I would say that a lot of the island building in the South China Sea, a lot of things we can talk about, trace back to this economic crisis that actually began here. It began in Wall Street, right? And so I think that is kind of the inspiration for all of this. And then one could say that this is actually a long-term strategy, a long-term project, and I would say that's true. Now, whether or not it's nefarious in the way that my friend Michael Pillsbury would talk about it in 100-year marathons and all, or not, that's almost a separate discussion. But I do think that there has been a long-term approach underway here, and we're just seeing, in many ways, the kind of culmination of that approach. Now, where China runs into some problems is it, for a long time, and even today, in its rhetoric, talks about the failure of the West in its treatment of developing countries. The colonialism, imperialism, and China builds its own reputation in part by tearing down the reputation of others who were imperial and rightfully ought to be criticized for that behavior. But in recent articles, I'm seeing a notion that China is now in this position, and China will behave as other countries in this position have behaved. Right? And that is a kind of transition where China is not saying, you're bad and we'll never do that too. China is saying, that was bad, and now that we're there, we may do a little bit of that too. Right? And so this is an interesting moment of history where we see the rhetoric and the reality kind of confronting each other. I always think reality tends to win, but we'll see where it goes. The final question in terms of green tech. I've been to the wind farms. I've seen the solar panels. I mean, it's really impressive. It's certainly not altruistic, right? I mean, it's the future. And in many ways, China is well suited with this very strong government approach to direct investment into the things that it believes to be the future. It used to believe those things were semiconductors. Now it sees it as this green tech. So I see it not as altruistic, but as an important economic play, as an important political play for the reasons you've said, right? As the U.S. is standing there tearing up the agreement, China is there pushing forward the agreement. But that being said, I would hasten to dampen enthusiasm. And the reason I would do that is, one of my research assistants she's from China, and she, in her undergraduate, was doing research for a major coal-producing province, and she was asked by her professor to find out what was the total emissions for the province. So she began by going to the 5 top emitters in the province and got the numbers. And she wrote them all down, and then she went to the fact book from the Chinese central government and found out that the 5 top emitters actually were emitting double what the central government believed the entire province was emitting. Not even the 6th was on the list, and it was already well above. And it's that kind of story, which I think some of us have heard in other contexts, which leads me to question whether or not you're going to be able to enforce, not just enforce on paper, not just get the people to say this is what's going on, but actually on the grassroots level enforce the emissions standards from the climate change agreement. And I hope I'm wrong about that, right? We'll all breathe cleaner air if I am. But I think that is an issue. And as I said before, there's a policy on top, but there's always going to be pushback. Thank you.
Eric?
So just very briefly, I know we've only got a little bit of time left, but on this question of, is Southeast Asia an incubator? It's a good term. I think I used similar language in the chapter itself as what happens in Southeast Asia is in a sense a harbinger of what sometimes happens later in other regions. It's, I think, similarly true of Central Asia as well. I mean, if we go back to China's lexicon, foreign policy lexicon again, it divides the world into sort of 3 categories: major states, peripheral states, the immediate periphery, and then the developing world. And that lexicon's evolved. We talked about the developing world. The periphery language has also evolved. So they now talk about the greater periphery. So the periphery used to be, Southeast Asia, East Asia, South Asia, and Central Asia. Now it stretches out in some versions to the Indian Ocean and Eastern Africa. So it's gotten larger. So I think you're going to see some of those issues cropping up outside of Southeast Asia. To what extent is Southeast Asia or other parts of the periphery unique? Well, yeah, and China doesn't have, for example, territorial disputes anywhere else. It's got them in South Asia and Southeast Asia, and I think that's pretty much it. So we could ask whether it will have the same conflictual relations that it does with some neighboring states. And I think the jury's out on whether it's going to sort of expand its horizons as far as its demands and behavior elsewhere. But if, for example, we look at some of its maritime behavior, it's not just around the islands that it's made some fairly startling claims, putting in terms of the EEZs that it claims around small islands. But it's also, for example, in its naval behavior. So when it operates its aircraft carrier, it has in the past issued a statement that other ships should stay clear to 30 kilometers. That's not something the U.S. Navy does. The U.S. Navy asks other ships to be cautious within 2 or 3 kilometers of the ship. But if you go out to 30 kilometers, I think that adds up to maybe 1,000 or more square kilometers of ocean space, and that's moving ocean space. So we don't really know how China is going to behave elsewhere as its military capabilities expand. On the economic side, I mean, we've talked about debt quite a bit. China did diagnose in 2013 the fact that it has all kinds of structural economic issues. I think there are other questions here. Yes, people have been predicting the demise of the Chinese economy for many, many years. Some have made professions of it. But I think there are changes just because it has adapted and made the necessary adjustments to date doesn't mean that it necessarily can or will in the future. And we have a new type of leadership. So prior to Xi Jinping, we basically had engineers who were willing to make great sacrifices in order to do what needed to be done to tackle sort of today's economic issues. Oftentimes that created 2 new problems, but Hopefully those were smaller than the ones it was resolving at the time, or at least less immediate. But Xi Jinping has really, I think, shifted China's priority and put much more weight on China's international political position. So it's a little bit unclear to me. Again, it diagnosed these problems in 2013, and it has not, in fact, made the sacrifices that it would need to make to shift from investment to consumption, for example, to drive economic growth. And then finally, well, I'll stop there. Thanks. Can't remember what the third point was.
It was the green one, but I got it.
Oh, actually, yes. Just very quickly on the green point. Question was, is this virtue or China's narrow interests? It's clearly not just, doing this to contribute to the world, but I think it's a little bit of both. And this is a pattern we've seen for the last 30 years in China. So China has severe environmental issues. This is one way that it can get a grip on its own environmental problems. It's tried to reduce the role of coal in the economy for 20 or 25 years now. It's tried to crack down on illegal coal mining. So by signing up to these accords, I think, to an extent, it has expectations similar to those that it had when it signed up to the WTO in terms of, furthering its economic reform agenda. So I think it's got to be a mix of both.
If I could just build on that one quick sentence. I think that reform and opening up have to go together. You can't reform without opening up. And it's the pressure that comes from the outside, from WTO, from joining the Paris climate change, that pushes internal reform to happen. And I think I'm pleased that I think that the Paris Climate Accord may do that, but I'm equally concerned that on other aspects, economic and other, China is not opening up anymore than it is. That China is closing in ways that prohibit it from having meaningful reform because that outside pressure is not taking place. So I just want to add that to your comment.
Well, I promised to give Ambassador Derek Mitchell the opportunity to say a few words. So if you'd bring the mic up here, and then I think we'll...
Now we're going to get upstaged.
Yeah.
Right? Now you're going to get upstaged. And then we're going to turn to allow you to sign some books.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, first, thank you for turning to me. I want to congratulate my colleagues on this and for taking it to the next step after 10 years ago, bringing it up to date. I haven't been able to read the book yet because I haven't gotten a hand on it, but I will get your signatures, and I'd be honored if I would. It raises a question. Again, I haven't read your conclusion, so I think it begs the question, everything that you've raised. So then what? What should the U.S. do? Why does this matter? So what? And what should the U.S. do in response? Now, there are various people that have written about the failures of the past and said, well, we got it wrong. And I guess some people maybe mistook that thought as being, well, we shouldn't have been, the engagement policy was wrong. And I think that was probably over-reading that critique. But it does then beg the question, do we then go forward with concern about what China's doing around the world and then respond to China everywhere and be concerned about and really focus on China and what it means as a rival, as a competitor, whether it's tariffs or whatever it is that is going on in our administration or just generally in the world through our Pacific Command or otherwise? Do we just South China Sea? Or is there another vision? It gets to your issue of values or rules. Is the best response not really about China, but about ourselves, about what we like to see in the world and how we build coalitions? I think you can tell by the question where I stand on this, that in fact we may have the strength within ourselves and what we represent. We have a great deal of power through soft power by simply not caring so much about what China does, but just doing what we do traditionally better. Which gets to the issue of competition. Competition in the economic terms is a good thing. It makes everyone more efficient. It raises your game.
Yes.
Is it bad to have competition around the world? Does that then force us to have to raise our game because we are not doing what we need to do in Africa, we're not raising our game in the in development, in assistance, and all the rest of it? So I think the prescription is going to be very important of what we do with this information, just as it was 10 years ago, but even more so now when I agree completely with what you said about this moment that China seizes of opportunity. They love getting in there. I wrote about this 10 years ago too. When we trip, they're in there next day and say we can do better and we can fix whatever ails you. But countries, I think, we appeal traditionally to the people of the country some to the governments, but they all appeal to that elite at the top to buy them off, et cetera. So what is it that we can do? What is the prescription in your mind as you look at all the chapters and think about this for a responsible American approach to the China challenge?
Okay, brief responses.
I think you're picking this one first.
Well, I'm in agreement with the premise of the question as well as I think where you were going with the answer. I'm old enough to have been sort of a veteran of the Japan wars, where there was actually quite a bit of panic, despite Japan's vibrant democracy, about Japan's rise, really, at the time when Japan's GDP was 2/3 that of the U.S., and we thought it would overtake that American GDP, and we thought Japan would organize an exclusive economic bloc in Asia, et cetera, and there were all kinds of predictions that went along with that. Obviously, we're all veterans also of the Cold War, where we sacrificed a lot of our values in the interest of competition. To me, for a variety of reasons, first of all, the challenge I don't think rises to that level of the Cold War. Also, I think we can do a lot more, in terms of raising the level of our game. It would require consistency. It probably requires a larger government role. To an extent, we have been successful in, we have some models, successful competition, if you will, competition for hearts and minds, values, economic leadership. Certainly in Asia, the changes in Burma are an example. So they're domestic cases. There are also institutional examples. So the fact that we got TPP signed, was an enormous success for the United States in terms of shifting the discussion, about economic reform and really governance reform, since they do go hand in hand. And unfortunately, we have, opted to withdraw from that. So I think, yes, we can raise the level of our game. We can maintain a consistent position. And the question is, will we? Certainly, I don't think we should sacrifice our values, in the interests of sort of short-term competition with China. You can see, when China does certainly step into the breach, and it does score some successes, but oftentimes those are reversed. So, we've seen this in the Philippines in the past, we've seen this in Burma, we've seen this elsewhere. So, I think consistency is the answer.
Yeah. So I'm in a bit of a disagreement with Derek on one thing. I'm not so sure the engagement strategy we pursued was entirely successful. In fact, that it should have been pursued in the blinkered optimistic way that we pursued it. The idea that Iraq, Afghanistan, China want to be like us, and that engaging a country that has engaged foreigners for 5,000 years and thinking we're going to change them, to me that's hubris. Was from the start, and what we should have done is accepted the fact that they're going to change us as much as we'll change them, and that they may well utilize that engagement strategy to build files out on our people and to do a whole bunch of other stuff that I don't think we were entirely willing to accept, because we had so many barbarian handlers which were so convincing, like Hu Yafei and others, and we just wanted to believe them so bad. So I'm not sure I entirely disagree with you, but I wouldn't entirely agree with you. I think that there was a more open-eyed policy approach, but it was a tougher approach. And we weren't ready to take it. And I just hope we are now through the looking glass on this. So I think the very first thing we can do is stop being blinkered optimists. In America, being an optimist is considered a good thing almost regardless of whether or not you should be or not. But optimism about the Communist Party of China has not served us well, and we should stop, right? If in a liberal sense, optimistic. I mean, Xi Jinping may be optimistic that he can achieve what he wants to achieve, but as a liberal, being optimistic about the liberalization of the party was wrong. And I hope that we're through the looking glass and we accept them for the authoritarians they are, right? And I think that if we start with that premise, I think we're going to be far better off in terms of our policy going forward. So the first thing is, be very open-eyed about who we're dealing with, and do not believe that I'm changing. I call it the Flandering husband routine, right? I'm changing, baby, I'm changing. No, you're not. You are who you are, and I accept you for that. Second, values and rules. I would agree with both of you here. I think the U.S. should be an exemplar, right? That if we are an exemplar nation, and we can do that, and we're not now, I agree, for many reasons we could go on and on about. But if we could do that, put our values in the front and lead by example, I think that that's really the best way to counter this, rather than rolling out the map and putting the chess pieces out on the board in a Cold War style, but leading with our values, leading with our norms, leading with our rules, the things we fought for so many decades to establish and are now kind of eating away at on our own. And then third, and I'm going to critique my own here as a political scientist, we should stop using IR theory so damn much to try to understand China. We should, we should stop saying they're a rising power and we're status quo power, and using that approach. I think that has really failed us, and it's allowed us to explain away the nature of the regime. Oh, they're not doing that because of the nature of the regime. They're doing that because they're a rising power. And I think that has done us great harm. That what we need to do is study more about who they are and what they do and what they write and what they say. This is from our mutual friend, Randy Shriver, right? And then make policy based on that. Not roll out the Mearsheimer and say, well, Mearsheimer says the rising power will do this and thus and so. I think that's almost insulting to the Chinese, and it doesn't lead to very good policy. And I think that successive administrations have adopted IR theory as a guide, a lodestar, and I think that has been a massive mistake. It has allowed us to look past the nature of the regime, and that has been wrong. And the final point I'll make on this very quickly is that China traditionally believes in this concept of the shi, of the propensity of things, that you go with the wind. When things are in your favor, you move. When they're not in your favor, you don't move. The right policy taken at the wrong time leads to a bad result, and even an imperfect policy taken at the right time can be successful. And so what we need to do is be cognizant of this, the nature of their thinking on this, and do our best to make sure that they don't believe that they have that, the wind at their back, right? I wouldn't say manipulate perceptions, but at least manage perceptions in a way which don't lead them to believe that the field is wide open, move forward as you will. I think that'll lead to more miscalculation from them, and it'll lead to more problems for us.
You get 1 minute.
Just very briefly.
Because we're really over time.
Okay. Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I just want to clarify. My last comments were about engagement with the developing world, not China. Okay. So in terms of our engagement with China, I agree we've made mistakes. I do think in terms of our values engagement with China, we should focus on specific behaviors and where China may be, have crossed lines, but we should be very specific to those behaviors and not sort of, in some cases exaggerate the extent to which China may be an outlier. Oftentimes there are other countries doing very similar things. We call out China and not the others. I think we should focus on behaviors, not China as strategic competitor. And I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, terrific. Great discussion, and I hope it stimulated all of you to have interest in wanting to read the book.
Yeah.
And so we're going to move to the book signing, and it will be outside on the table. And apparently, one person who came in picked up a book off the table. If that happened to be any one of you, please, on your way out, pay for it. I'm really glad you want to read it, though. And please join me in thanking our two speakers and our authors.
Bonnie, thank you so much.